Hi, I'm Dr. Sadhna Bokhiria, and this is LeaderVoices, a show about leaders and their infinite ability to change the world. Each episode in LeaderVoices, we dig into stories and sparks from for-purpose leaders, coaches, comedians, luminaries, and everyday heroes from around the globe. Tales of impact and failing forward, of aspirations and innovations, and the infinite and inspiring ways that social purpose leaders lead and make the world a better place. Join us today as we introduce a new guest. I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Daniel Emerling to LeaderVoices. Dr. Emerling is a senior vice president and head of research at Annexon Biosciences. Originally a biochemist and neurobiologist, he discovered and developed multiple therapeutics for diseases of the nervous system, as well as for oncology, autoimmune, metabolic, and infectious diseases. He has been in the biotech industry for over 20 years and is also the inventor of several drugs, including an antibody to prevent malaria in pediatric populations that's currently in clinical development and funded by none other than the biggest people in the industry, the Gates Medical Research Institute. His research is also supported by Bloomberg Philanthropies and the Malaria Research Institute. It is such a pleasure, and I'm still wondering if this is actually happening. Is this really happening? Is this real? To welcome you to LeaderVoices. So thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you. So let's start right at the beginning. What inspired you to get into this line of work? What were you like as a kid? Were you always interested in saving people?
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, no, not saving people. I was a kid. I was too selfish. I was always interested in science. When I got into college, I thought I would be doing something math, and then I took like an honors math class at Berkeley that had 4 people in it, and I discovered I'm not the best mathematician in the world, actually, like I thought I was. And so I started thinking, well, I'll go into maybe astrophysics, maybe biology. And so I took a few different courses, and just, biochemistry just was exciting and fun and interesting. But I pretty quickly really got interested in, kind of philosophy of the mind and where does the mind come from? And, being a scientifically minded person, I assumed it was an outgrowth of the brain. And so I also got really interested in neurobiology, and that's why eventually I became a neurobiologist. So.
Fascinating. Not like you're an overachiever at all.
There's a lot of overachiever at Cal, so, I'm probably there in the middle of overachievers. But thank you. It's nice.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So one of the things that I always thought was really interesting when we first spoke is this whole concept of being in a position where I think success is measured maybe differently, and this concept of being an explorer. Can you tell me a little bit about that in your professional world? How is success measured?
Well, in the biotech industry, success is measured by delivering, product, delivering deliverables, things that people can use, that they can advance, they can invest in. And so, in that sense, it's kind of an unfair bar because 9 out of 10 drugs fail, pretty much. Something like that. So it's probably the most failure-ridden industry in human history, is my guess. Up there with like diamond mine hunting and things like that. I pretty much early on decided that if that's going to be my measure of whether I'm doing useful work, I'm going to be a pretty unhappy person. So I just started looking for other measures, and it wasn't hard to realize that just the process, the journey, is more important than the destination kind of philosophy. And that idea is out there. I didn't invent it as an attitude and a philosophy about life in general. So I think I took that on pretty early in how I looked at being a scientist. That discovering things that people hadn't seen before is a privilege. It's awesome. It's an amazing thing to get to experience. And if it happens to become useful, great. If it doesn't, at least the experience was fun and interesting. And so I think I've done a better job later in life applying that same philosophy to everything in my life as opposed to just my work. And that's helped me, I think, be a happier person in general, a more fulfilled person in general. So I'd say that's kind of my 100-word spiel on being an explorer.
So what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm incorrect here. So what I'm hearing is that it's a certain level of presence, and you're not really focused. If 9 out of 10 of your projects fail, you can't be focused on the end, right? You have to be present in the moments where you're working on these projects.
Yeah, and you have to well, you don't have to, but I have to. It's like cutting up the journey into bite-sized pieces so that there are things you achieve. They're just not the ultimate goal. For example, of actually having a drug that will help patients, it may not get there, but there's going to be truths and things about the universe discovered that will probably be useful. And like I said, if they've never been seen before, even not knowing whether they will be useful or not has its own pleasure to it. That is the essence of exploration, finding things that others have never seen. And remember like when we were a kid and you would go to some new place that you were kind of excited about, and just that rush, that adrenaline of getting to explore it. And it didn't matter if other people had already found it or experienced it or explored it before, because it was the first for you as a kid. It was the ultimate to be able to explore this new place, whether it was being at Disneyland for the first time or whatever it was. And so it's trying to capture that feeling in more everyday things, basically. And so, I try to look at, like, for example, I'm kind of an introvert. I mean, particularly when I was younger, I was definitely an introvert, although I've been able to fake being an extrovert long enough now, or maybe I actually have some extrovert qualities. So I tend to look at, like, when I'm going to go into a social situation that might give me a little of that introvert anxiety, I very quickly try to look at it like, this is an exploration to see what happens. It's like a social experiment I'm going to be part of. And I do that even with the smallest things, a meeting where I still have to go up in front of people and get a little nervous when I'm talking to a big room. I'll try to look at it like, this is an exploration to see how this experiment goes. So like I said, I just try to apply it to everything in life, and it makes my life a little bit more exciting. And definitely, I'm a happier person with how things come out.
Yeah, it seems like a very healthy mindset to be very much focused on the fact that you don't really know what the outcome is going to be, and to kind of ground yourself in that knowledge and validation that this is just a moment. It's just an experiment. What's the worst that could happen? It sounds like a great leadership tool.
Yeah, maybe it is. That's a good point. I do want, before we get into that, I want to go back to the point you said about being in the moment. These fears will come up in some situations. I'm using social situations for me because, like I said, I have that introvert property. But it balances the fears with something that's not a fear, right? There's going to be something interesting that might happen here, that, I get to discover something, maybe about myself, maybe about other people, maybe about how I interact. And so focusing on that means I'm not focusing on the fears as much. And so that's the being in the present for me. It's trying to push the fear away a little bit and replace it with something that has some excitement to it, possibly something interesting, and possibly growth, which is what I think you were getting at there. It is definitely part of a growth mindset, I think.
Yes, it's really.
I don't think I answered your question there, but.
No, I think it's an experiment, right? And it's us trying to explore and understand the way in which we both, because I'm introverted as well. And so I kind of have to have those pep talks as well, where it's like, how am I going to go into this and be able to, have more confidence? And so it's almost like a pep talk to myself when I'm going into those situations where I have to remind myself, this, because I was talking to someone about this yesterday. In your mind, social rejection is very painful, and we all want to fit in. And if you are leaning more on kind of the introverted side and you have this fear, which happens, I think, to a lot of people, those reminders that, this is just a moment, you're not sure what's going to happen. It grounds you in that space. And I tend to be very much, I struggle with not focusing on, once I do this, this, and this, then I'll get my prize, my gold star, because I like gold stars and awards. So I'm trying to be more like you, where I have to say, let's not focus on that gold star. Let's focus on the experience. And it's always better for me when I do, because, you're present and you're really, some people say that's the highest form of living, being here.
I mean, I think it is. Basically, that's the core of meditation, right? Being here, focusing on breath in the moment. But you did use the word experiment, which for me is the key. I've learned this from being a scientist and trying to apply it to other things, which is I'm going into experiment. Usually they don't work, certainly when you're doing them the first time. And so this idea that focusing on the reward, like you're saying, when you kind of know that reward's probably not going to come in this round. If I'm lucky and I do this experiment enough and refine it and get the right controls in there, I might actually come to some learnings and some conclusions. It's almost like that pessimism gets turned on its head. And it's that journey of exploring that is the fun part. And so focusing on the now and the exploring part of it. Whatever it is, I'll be experiencing something new probably and different. And again, that's just kind of pushing away the fear of it's not going to work. Things will be bad. If I get in front of the room of people, I'm going to embarrass myself, right? Even though those things might even be true, it allows me to psychologically push them aside and have the moment I'm in, to get back to your point about the moment I'm in now is filled with ideas that are a little bit more exciting, a little bit more intriguing because something interesting might happen. And that's a more positive idea than how it's going to go wrong in your thoughts.
Right.
So it's a little mind jujitsu. It's a little fooling myself a little bit, but I've gone through it enough now where I've realized it is a good way to go because things usually do turn out a little bit interesting. There always is something I can learn out of it, usually, that kind of thing.
I love the term, a little bit of mind jujitsu. That's a first. I'm going to steal that from you.
Yeah. Well, there are so many, in the kind of self-improvement world out there, there's all these things about fake it till you make it. If you smile in the mirror when you're not feeling good, you'll feel a little better. Those are mind jujitsu, right? You're fooling yourself, but it kind of works.
Right.
Another really good one I like is, I think, Andrew Huberman,
I love him.
the professor at Stanford does. Yeah. His thing is, he frames it all around dopamine, but like when you're exerting yourself, usually he's talking about physical exertion, but I think this can work for anything. And you're trying to motivate yourself by thinking about how you're going to reward yourself later. Instead, tell yourself that the pain you're feeling right now, like if it's the burn in your muscles, that is the reward. And it's ridiculous because it's not, right? It's like, it's pain. It doesn't feel good. But when you start telling yourself that, it kind of works. And that pain starts actually not feeling so painful, the 10th time you've done it, just by fooling yourself and telling yourself this pain is the reward. And so that is mind jujitsu, I think.
Very cool. Very cool.
It's playing yourself for a sucker.
Whatever works, the mind is such a fascinating concept in itself. And I'm curious in terms of, what do you think about identity? So I'll give you the frame to this. So if you're thinking about what makes you from a scientific perspective, and you think about something like a brain tumor or a brain injury where people have severe changes in their behavior and what other people would say, oh no, that's not him. That's not how he is. How do you balance the science of what makes your brain work and your mind and your identity when you have examples of people who have scientific, brain tumors, different types of accidents, traumas that drastically change their personality?
You mean like by definition it's them because it's inside them? So saying that it's not them is kind of a weird contradiction? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
I mean, it's this question with like the mind, brain, body connection. And it's something that I struggle with. Like, what makes me me?
Well, I got this from a friend, actually. She's super smart. And, she kind of frames it in we have a bunch of characters in us. And this came about by us talking about having taken a personality test and kind of how I came out a little bit on the extrovert side for the first time ever on that personality test. And I always kind of came out on the introvert side a little bit. And, her description of that was, well, you have different people in you and some of them are just a little more louder at different times or something like that is how she framed it. But that is how I now kind of think of it. It's like we have a lot of characters in us, and we tend to think of ourselves as unitary. I mean, that is the concept of being me, is I am just me. I'm one thing. But in reality, we are these different things, these different traits, and they come out stronger or weaker at different times. And so we're kind of different. We're really different people that all trying to pretend we're one person in a way. That's how I like to think of it. It's not, that's kind of folk psychology. It's not a really hardcore science way of looking at the mind per se, but it does work when you actually try to shift it into the framework of how the brain is, because, the brain is a multitude of circuits that overlap, right? And, more synapses than stars in the universe kind of thing. And, or stars in the galaxy, let me rephrase that. And so different circuits are playing a stronger role at different times. They're more salient in what's driving your behavior and your thoughts at one time versus another. And they all kind of add up to what we think is us until we start getting out of that zone where we think it's not us, like you said. But I think it's all an illusion. We're really a lot of different things. And at any one moment, we're slightly different than we were before. I just told you, I used to be more introvert than I was, and you have to believe that if you believe in a growth mindset.
Right.
Like if you don't believe that, how can you believe in growth? Because growth by definition is change. And if by definition, if you've grown, you're a little bit different than the person you were before. So it all kind of fits into that.
Sure. No, it's a great way of putting it. In a way, what you're saying is that there's different aspects of our personalities. And as we grow, we're able to choose which aspects we want to improve upon and which aspects we no longer identify with. So it's easier for us to be the person that we want to be by kind of muting and accelerating different parts of our psyche. I love that.
Yeah, if you're really good at it, I don't think I'm there yet in life in being able to truly control which characters come out at which moments, but I'm trying, and certainly being a manager and a leader has helped me a lot with that. Probably just because the incentives for trying harder are evident, and, than say doing so with my kids. And so I am often spending mental time trying to be intentional about which characters are coming out. Yeah.
Great.
But, not perfect.
Of course. But it's inspiring to think about the mind jujitsu, as you say, and the way in which you can flex these different aspects of development and growth.
Yeah, maybe a way to put that in the context of characters is it's getting one of your characters to actually kind of fool another character.
Really interesting.
And then, you could ask, well, who's the person orchestrating all these characters? Is that the real you? And I'm not even going to try to answer.
All the voices. It's really interesting. So tell me a little bit about the different disease states. So we spoke a little bit about this before, about the different areas that you're interested in making an impact in terms of the therapies, the need in the world compared from oncology to malaria. How do you choose and just tell us about that aspect of your life when you're.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I definitely, and this is certainly more true later in life than when I was younger and, more naive and ignorant. But, I definitely appreciate, that I got a good education, that I got to live in a place where my needs were taken care of compared to most people on the planet. And so, I do feel a little obligation there to try to use those skills, for benefit of people. And if I'm going to be involved in biotherapeutics, I'm going to try to focus on things where I think there's, unmet need, which is the cliched term for, driving decisions in healthcare overall. And it was pretty easy to make that case for infectious diseases. We certainly have the science to cure a lot of infectious diseases out there or treat them well, but we don't, and that's mostly an economics issue. Whereas, say, in neurodegeneration, it's the other way around, I think. I think the unmet need is not being met because we really don't know the science yet of how, cells and molecules can get into states that cause Alzheimer's. We really don't. And so I've been really lucky to be able to work on, both of those kinds of problems that aren't really advancing as fast as we would like because the science isn't there yet and our understanding isn't there yet. And that's an interesting challenge. Unfortunate for a lot of patients, but a real challenge for people that want to try to find treatments and cures. And I've gotten to work on infectious diseases where the science is pretty much there for a lot of potential treatments and cures, but the economics isn't. And I was lucky enough to have a funding source, the Gates Foundation, to help with that work. And so, now I'm focusing more on neurodegeneration, and that's just a mix of choices and opportunities that have come around. But I would still love to work on infectious diseases. I think cancer, does have a lot of unmet need until, every patient gets the treatment they feel they need. There's always an unmet need, but there's certainly been a revolution in cancer with immuno-oncology where we've really gotten to address a lot of unmet need in cancer. So, maybe that one's not as in demand as neurodegeneration in my mind. So I'm trying to focus on neurodegeneration for my personal journey. But certainly, anyone who is trying to help patients in any disease, I think that's an ethically noble cause in general. So did I answer your question?
You did. And so what you're saying is that you're looking for treatments that are not heavily funded because the science is there and that you could make an impact in the demographic, but traditionally it hasn't been heavily funded because the money really isn't there. The people who need, like malaria, for instance, the people who need that in their ecosystems, their demographics don't have the funding, so there's not as much attention. Or maybe if there was, we'd already have a lot of treatment in those areas.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. If there's a lot more funding, humanity has been working on a malaria vaccine for like a century. And the first one ever that was, I'll say recommended for use or approved only happened 2 years ago. I think that probably would have happened quicker if there had been the kind of funding for malaria that there's been for cancer. That's a hypothetical. I don't know, not a controlled experiment, but the fact that when the funding really started flowing because there was a nonprofit that had the kind of money that a big pharma has, and they committed to that, we saw a lot of things happen within a couple decades. So that to me kind of indicates that, well, could have some of that stuff had happened earlier? And I think the answer for me as a scientist would have been yes, judging that, given the techniques that are around and things like that. So, but to get back to your kind of summary there, just for my personal journey, when I'm trying to make sure my work has purpose for me, it would be infectious diseases that have unmet need because I feel that we're there scientifically, but not there with the labor and the investment. Or for me now, it's neurobiology because I've always loved the brain and neurobiology. That really has been my passion scientifically since I was pretty young. And I've been out of that field for a while, and not much has happened in that field that's amazing. I mean, there have been some drugs approved that maybe have made some incremental progress, but I don't think anyone in the field would say that neurodegeneration is where we'd like it to be as far as the treatments for patients goes. It's very far behind, say, oncology in my mind. So that to me is again, a privilege that I do get to work on that, and that I found a way that it has purpose for me. So sorry, that was a lot of words, but
no, it's fascinating. I appreciate you sharing, your perspective, because I don't think a lot of people understand how the process works and exactly how long it takes to develop some of these therapies. Tell us a little bit about that. What does it look like?
Well, like I said, that it's the most failing industry probably in human history. I'm guessing on that. I haven't done the quantitative analyses to know for sure, but no one would dispute that it's a very failing industry compared to how we'd like it, compared to most products. When a drug enters the clinic, there's about a 10% chance it actually gets to patients on market someday. That being said, those failures are lessons, and they are required because the only way to know if something works in a human is to test it in a human. If animals were really, or virtual systems or computer simulations were predictive of human, then all drugs would succeed, and most don't. So we don't have the kind of predictive systems we would want, and I'm not sure we ever will until we understand at the complete atomic level how the body works. And that's far, far from now, even with AI. So people don't appreciate how difficult it is to really make a drug. It is more than an engineering exercise. It's a combination of discovering things that aren't known, and then it's an engineering exercise. Whereas usually, say, making a car is pretty much just an engineering exercise. There's not much new discovery that needs to happen there. Of course, if it's a cutting edge car being, fueled by banana peels, then yeah, you're making something new. But then it's the banana peel energy technology discovery that's new, and that's going to apply to things that are more expensive than cars. So my point just being that making drugs is more discovery than engineering in a way, in my opinion. And therefore, it takes a lot longer. There's a lot more failure. There's things we think we understand and we find out later we didn't completely understand. And those are learnings, but they take years to walk through. And that's why making a drug takes a long time. And you're right, people don't appreciate that. I think there's often, in the political world, there's often an idea that we just need to fund things that are going to work, as if that's simple to do, and people are purposely funding things that don't work. Again, if it was clear what would work, then all VC investors would be successful, right? So stop me, because I can just keep talking about this forever, because I think it's a major aspect of the conundrum of healthcare investment in this country, actually.
What's fascinating to me is it sounds like I'm interested in kind of your personality and your perspective. And it sounds like you're in an industry which is high risk. So the people who are investing in these drugs, if you're saying only 10%, so 90% failure rate, they're risky, right? But they're taking a chance because the reward is so impactful in terms of what it'll do for the world and patients. But you're a scientist. Like, even when you talk, you say, I don't know if I have the evidence to say this, but this is my opinion. So it's like you're very structural and analytical, but you're in like this high risk. And you're also an entrepreneur because you were involved in multiple biotech startups. So I'm trying to wrap my head around your psychology, because you have like these contradictory elements. Tell us about like the entrepreneur inside of the scientist.
Yeah, I mean, I got a lot of contradictions inside me, but I guess most people do to some degree. I'll pick one, because that's a big topic you just. So let's go with, the idea that science is about fact and what you know, not what you guess or you think or what you believe. Indeed, it's not belief, it's knowing. That's kind of the difference between science and faith, is the idea, right? Is that you only really will make a judgment when you have the facts based on empirical observation and testing, right? At the same time, there is so much unknown, and your experiments usually fail, that you have to be comfortable with the idea of ambiguity and not knowing, or you'd give up, right? So that's a contradiction that I have incorporated into my whole personality, I think, through my life, which is ambiguity can be scary, or a challenge that might see too much to take on. But then I flip it around and I'm an explorer. So ambiguity is an opportunity for exploration. Ambiguity is an opportunity to go discover new things that no one has ever seen before. And that's exciting and fun, right? That's being on the bow of the ship going across an ocean that no one has really gone across before. And so I love ambiguity in a way, even though I'm trying to get rid of it and clear it out with facts, right? And replace it with facts. At the same time, I like it. And that is only through this mindset that I've tried to get myself into, throughout my life to some degree. So the contradiction between fact and knowledge, and ambiguity and guessing and belief, to me, are just two sides of the same coin, which is the coin of the exploration to know and learn more about the universe, and therefore learn more about ourselves. So I think that's kind of how I have packaged that contradiction into my, acceptance and
Really, yeah,
and
really well,
motivation and motivation and motivation. Yeah.
really well put. As a parent, do you have trouble conveying this to your children, or do they just get it?
Indirectly, I think they get it. Directly, they hate it. Of course, directly, if I don't give a straight answer that's clear and obvious, it's just super frustrating for them. And so I try to view that as, they're on their journey with this topic, and it's fine. They'll go where they go. I mean, they both are, science type people. My eldest works in AI finance. He's a computer scientist. My youngest is about to go to college. And
I pictured them to be very small children. I didn't realize that they were.
No, actually, they're not. My youngest just turned 18 a few weeks ago, actually. So in theory, technically, I don't have any children anymore.
That's crazy.
Oh yeah, I'm way older than all the Zoom cleanup here just makes me look younger than I.
What about your experience as an entrepreneur and like some of the startups you were involved in? How is that different in terms of the experimentation and the risk from being in the position you're in now?
I would say my attitude about ambiguity, like, is this, again, I'm not an investor entrepreneur. I'm a creator entrepreneur. So for me, the decisions are more about like, should we pursue this project? Should we try to develop this technology? That kind of thing. Not, should I invest in something? Or I guess I can look at it as, should I invest mine and people on the team's time in this decision? And there is, of course, ambiguity, like there is for anyone making business decisions. They don't really know, is there a market for my product? Those kinds of things. But I try to accept the fact, and it's hard for me, that it may not ever be clear, right? Because it's not, in other words, it's not the same as it will be with an experiment. The idea of an experiment is eventually I will get my experiment here. If I do it over, multiple times with, again, bringing in other controls, maybe adding some other arms to the experiment, things like that, I will eventually get a very clear answer, which should be, this hypothesis is not true. Because that's the scientific method. You disprove hypotheses. And then if you do enough disproving, you're willing to put your belief that the hypothesis is true. And so that's kind of the scientific method. It's not exactly going and proving an hypothesis true. It's proving counter hypotheses aren't true. And so there is this idea that I will get to clarity. And for the explorer in me, that's great, because then there'll be some other question after that. There'll always be another ocean to cross, another continent to walk across, right? Even if you cross one of them, there's always more to discover. But in business, it's a little bit, you kind of don't get that privilege. And you don't get the controlled experiment. And so a lot of the judgment calls, you'll really never know. For the ones you didn't make, for the ones you decided to not pursue, would they have been great? Or the one that you did pursue, if you had done it a little differently, like you were thinking about at the beginning, but then you changed your mind how to pursue it, would that have been better? And so it's a little harder to, I guess it's like a lot of decisions in life, it's a little harder to manage regret around those things. Whereas I think for experimentation, you don't really have to deal with regret if you're allowed to fully pursue the experiment all the way to the end. You'll know. You might regret that the outcome isn't what you want, but you won't regret your decisions to try to find that outcome. In business and like a lot of other decisions in life, you may never get to know. You decided X over Y, X didn't succeed. You'll wonder, if I had done Y, would it have succeeded? You just don't get the clarity that the beauty that science can sometimes give you. So it's harder emotionally than as an entrepreneur than as a scientist in some ways.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, and correct me, the regret is in not being able to have different avenues to explore. And as a scientist, you have more avenues to test. So there's less regret.
Well, I guess it's just in science, you really know you can get a clear answer, even if it's not the answer you want, if everything works like it's supposed to in the scientific method. In life, business, being an entrepreneur, you don't get controlled experiments, basically. You don't get to repeat the experiment. You don't get all of these things that you can do in science. Some ways it might be why humanity eventually came upon the scientific method, is to have, a process that does allow for this true clarity of an answer. And the regret is, did I make the right decision? I guess is what it really, the emotional regret is really, I'll never know if the other decision might have been better, or I did make the best possible decision, even though it didn't come out the way I wanted. None of the decisions would have come out the way you'll just never know the answers to those questions. I mean, maybe in some cases you get the privilege of redoing or doing things in parallel and things like that. But in most cases in life, you don't. And in most cases in business, you don't. Investors aren't willing to give you 2 chances, 2 bites at the apple, those kinds of things, right? So, I'll often hear in business those things like, oh, well, someone tried that and it didn't work, so no one should try it again, right? You'll often hear that as a reason to not invest. The investor will give you. And that's really not true, right? Because it assumes that the project was defined by the goal of the project. And since it wasn't reached, that goal is not reachable by anyone. But of course, the project is also defined by all the methods and all the people involved. And there's lots of ways that can be done wrong. And it could be doing it again with different methods, different people, different timelines, et cetera. It might have succeeded. Again, we'll never know, because in life, people often don't give you second chances, or at least second chances at the exact same thing. So the regret is that emotional, I think, process of questioning yourself, questioning whether it could have been done better and it would have succeeded, and not being able to go back and find out. And so I struggle with that a lot, actually.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people do.
Me too. I can see why, because there's this conflict between wanting to know what works and then going through what you have to go through to determine what will work. And
yeah, I mean, let me ask you, since you're an entrepreneur too, and you've started businesses, and you've had to make a lot of big decisions that affect you and other people. Like, you've probably experienced regret, right? How much of that regret is intellectual and how much of it is emotional? And for me, I'm going to let you answer, but for me, the emotional part is the hard part. Intellectually, I can wrap my head around it. Oh, it's just another case of ambiguity, and I just won't get to clarify that ambiguity. Sure. I have a way of dealing with that intellectually. But there's still some kind of emotional component, because it did affect my life, and therefore it's consequential. And all these emotions then come in. Would my life have been different if I had just decided that thing before, if I decided Y instead of X? And so all these emotions are associated with that. So depending on how the regret is intellectual or emotional, it can be a big difference for me. But how is that for you?
That's a great question. I'd say that you're right. It's spot on that the intellectual regrets are more so in hindsight. The lesson I learned from that experience, I would have maybe had an easier time if I did X instead of Y. The emotional regret is when you start associating it and creating stories. Oh, I lost so much time. You add the story to the fact.
Exactly.
So it's interesting, because I was talking about this yesterday, where it's like, you have fact, and then there's so much heartache and pain that happens in between the fact and the story. So fact, I made this decision. There were some positives and negatives. Okay. But you can take those negatives and leap to these stories of, oh, if only, blah, blah, I wouldn't have wasted. And so the intellectual failures or intellectual lessons, or whatever word choice you want to use, are a lot easier to deal with than the emotional stories we create as a result of those experiences, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's really well. Yeah, it totally makes sense. So is the lesson there, stop at the intellectual analysis and don't tell yourself any stories and try to move on? Or is there some benefit to those stories, even if they're painful, emotionally? I don't know. That might be a rhetorical question.
It's interesting. So to go full circle to my original brain tumor question, like what makes someone who they are? What happened to me is I had this horrific experience with a person. And the only way I could justify his behavior was to say he has to have a brain tumor. There's no way that this is who he is. He has to have a brain tumor. So I actually like convinced myself that this was like an actual physical ailment. And that was okay because I could rationalize that and say, okay, like this is not him, it's something else. But then when I realized he didn't have a brain tumor, it was quite devastating for me. I would have preferred the brain tumor than to learn he was just an asshole.
Because that reflects on your trust of this person, basically. Yeah, and your ability to evaluate people.
Yes.
Yeah, but I guess getting back to the multiple circuits as an analogy for multiple characters within us. So, you can look at it like there was something that changed this person, and it could just be one of the characters stopped talking, or a character that used to never talk suddenly became the loudest character. Yeah. And you don't need to go all the way to a brain tumor. It could just be something inside of them that was always there that either is now more repressed or is now not repressed. And I don't know if that makes you a little bit more comfortable with the idea about this person not having a brain tumor, but still being an apparently different person. But I think we all do that very slowly as we go through life. We slowly change, and some characters come out a little bit more or less than they used to. And if we're someone that's really into growth and we really pay attention to that, personal improvement and all that, it probably happens a little bit more. And I think that's a good thing. I think that, the environment around us is changing throughout our life. We should be changing throughout our life.
Yes.
Yes. So to me, it's a fun thing to think about, a cool thing to think about.
So would you say that you're a pessimist or an optimist?
I would say I'm a recovering pessimist.
Okay. Tell us more. You got to tell us more.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's been 35 years now that I've been in Pessimists Anonymous. And, I've gone through the 12 steps. Why more? I think I think it comes down to gratitude. I think, I say that with kind of almost a pain on my face, because I feel guilty that I wasn't more grateful about things I've gotten in life when I was younger. But, basically most people in this country live a lot better than people all over the world, right? And just that core fact, regardless of opportunities that, that I've either been able to leverage and exploit and all that kind of stuff, just that core fact, I appreciate more and more through life. And that makes me just a little bit more of an optimist, because it puts, failures and, things that I've done that I regret, getting back to regret and stuff, just in a perspective of it's still so much better than it could be, and I think that's just over time made me less and less pessimistic for some reason, even though there may not be directly connected, because pessimism and optimism is about future projection. And what I'm talking about is about past projection, like where I've come from, what I've had. I should appreciate it. I should consider myself pretty lucky, because a lot of what's determined in our life is just about where and who we're born with, right? So I think that's probably one of the main things, is just gratitude and appreciating the things I've gotten and the privileges I've had that kind of come down to luck in a lot of ways. And then, I am a little bit proud of myself for more and more leveraging those things better, because that is me, and my behavior and how I respond to opportunities and stuff. But again, it comes down a lot to having a really, really strong foundation that I couldn't even really control, right? Where I was born, the economics I was born into, those kind of things. And so that just has made me be like, things could be so much worse, be appreciative. And then that makes me, when new things come in, I'm just a little bit more optimistic about it. Although I got to say, I still have my pessimist ability to go through every possible scenario. Like you were saying, the stories, but the stories about the future instead of the stories about the past. And I totally go through all the negative scenarios. I definitely do. I maybe even spend more time on the negative scenarios mentally than the positive scenarios, but I try to go through kind of all the scenarios that can happen with something. It's a bit of a game theory view of life in a lot of ways. And that hasn't made me more pessimistic over time, keeping that behavior. layering on gratitude has made that behavior, I think, keep me realistic while also being a little bit more optimistic.
Yeah,
Although
really.
there's still plenty of pessimism. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that's really interesting. So this concept of you running through all of the worst case scenarios, does it help you make better decisions, or do you do that? Is it impacting your decision making by running through all those? Because I do the same thing. So it's like you're my therapist today, Dr. Emerling. How do I deal with?
I thought you were my therapist here. I'm asking the question. What's your question exactly? I'm sorry, I talked.
No, it's okay. So when you go through all the worst things that could happen, all the different stories, do they help you make your decisions in what you end up doing that promotes your optimism and kind of?
I mean, it's a hard question to answer. Again, getting back to in life, we don't get to do the perfect experiments, and so. I'll go through my analysis to make a decision. I'll kind of do that kind of game theory, like what if this happens? What if that happens? What if that happens? And a lot of those scenarios are negative. And then real life will happen. I'll make the decision and real life will happen. And sometimes I succeed, sometimes I fail, sometimes it's more muddled in between. Although I will plug the idea of whenever there's a failure, don't waste a good crisis. Try to get something good out of it. Yes. But I don't really know, what if I had not done all those analyses? What if I had just flipped a coin, or gone with my gut or whatever? I don't get the privilege of that experiment. So I don't really know. Overall, just looking at the history of my decisions, I think generally that behavior has been good for me. That way of thinking has been good for me because I can think of some really big disasters that have occurred in my life. And I think I was better prepared for them because I'd already thought that they could happen. And I was, a little more prepared, which mitigated my anxiety a bit going through it. But I don't really know, what would have happened if I was shocked by that disaster and I hadn't planned for it all. Maybe I would have saved myself a lot of pre-anxiety, so I don't think I can really answer that question. We would have to have another me that was parallel, that kind of lived the same life, but just didn't have that one behavior of going through every bad scenario in my head before, I made the decision. But it is the way I am, so I'm gonna have to live with it.
Yes, I understand.
I just can't not do that thinking. I really can't. It's I have a mind that kind of thinks about 10 things at the same time in parallel. And it's just natural when I have a decision I know I need to make. I'm going through these scenarios. Even when I'm doing other things, the scenarios are playing out in my head for the decision I know is pending that I need to make soon. And I don't think I can undo that. I think that's really embedded in there. And maybe a brain tumor would get me to not do that, but there would have to be really some material substrate biology to change who I am to get rid of that behavior.
So what are you excited about in the sector? What kind of therapy developments, research? What are you excited about?
We actually get to talk about my work. I am very excited about where neurodegeneration is going and where infectious disease treatments are going. Which one do you want to talk about?
Let's start with infectious disease.
Yeah. Okay. So. I mentioned, malaria, people have been working on it. So there's 2 malaria vaccines, just 2 years when there have been none for like a century of people trying that have been, and I say approved, but it's a little more complicated than that because a lot of the countries where these vaccines are really being used, in more developing countries, in tropical zones, they don't really have a lot of the regulatory infrastructures to like approve or, not approve drugs and things like that. So a lot of these things come down to like the World Health Organization saying, we recommend the use of this vaccine in Cameroon or wherever. And then of course, the government of Cameroon and communities within Cameroon need to be on board with that, but it's not a real regulatory approval. That is actually, I'm pretty sure, the first vaccine for any parasite ever. And parasites, we don't really think about them in economically advanced countries, but in the developed world, there's lots of parasites, and they're insanely scary and when you talk to people about them that have never really heard of these things and don't live with them, it's like horror, worms coming out of your eye and weird, horrible things. Yeah. And it's shocking that there's really no treatments or cures for these things. I mean, there are for some, but there's so many of them. Again, ones that I still learn about new ones, and I've been in this field for years now. There's just a lot more momentum now moving into that. And a lot of that got handed off to the Gates Foundation because just such a large pool of money. They are like big pharma size when it comes, global big pharma size when it comes to money, but they don't care about profit. They care about, treating these diseases. And a lot of other things. They work in a lot of other areas too, education, things like that. But, and so I think their work has started to see, people appreciate it more now, I think, in the field and outside the field, whether it's policymakers or, medical community people or patient community people. And so I'm just seeing a lot more momentum, and I get a feeling that a lot more of these diseases will be treated. And on top of that, or in addition to that, the COVID pandemic really added a whole nother layer as well. You now have labs making antibody therapeutics to diseases that don't yet have any kind of pandemic or endemic process, phenomenon going on. There's still like pretty rare diseases that are only in one little geography. But there's a worry that they'll break out like COVID did. And instead of us as a world health community reacting and trying to start finding treatments like we did with COVID, which was insanely impressive how quickly vaccines and monoclonal antibodies and small molecule drugs, got advanced and approved for COVID. We're being a little bit more proactive in our thinking about it. To be honest, if the Trump administration hadn't come in, we'd probably be a lot more advanced because there was a pandemic response policy all written up and ready to go. But when the Trump administration came in, they threw that policy into the trash. And then like a year and a half later, COVID happened. So we're kind of retrapping a little bit, I think, in this country on policymakers being involved and catching up. But I'm really optimistic about infectious disease treatments for a lot of these unmet needs for, like I said, diseases that some of us haven't even heard about before. Because of the more recent successes and because of COVID.
And so on the other fronts, in terms of the neurodegeneration, how do you feel there?
I think it's a little less evident than it is for infectious disease that there's momentum, but there is momentum. The FDA recently approved a couple Alzheimer's drugs that, to be honest, a lot of people are kind of questioning why they are even approved. The effect and the benefit is so small, but because there's so much unmet need and there's really not really any kind of disease modifying treatments out there, I think the regulatory authorities, the bar has been lowered a bit over time. Because, the first real Alzheimer therapies entered the clinic, more than 2 decades ago, really. And nothing had really gotten approved. And so I think, the bar has been lowered a bit, which you could say is not a good thing in some ways, but it also can be a good thing because that can encourage more investment. That can encourage more, scientists working on those problems. And that can help build the momentum. And I also think because there's been overinvestment in some ways in some other unmet need areas like oncology and infectious diseases. And when I say overinvestment, that doesn't mean the investment is bad or it shouldn't have happened. It just means that investors have put in so much that they're now backing off a little bit. That's what I really mean by that. Maybe overinvestment is not the right word, but maybe we're in the rain shadow of investment on infectious diseases because there was so much investment during the pandemic that there's been a little bit of a decrease in infectious disease investment. That might be happening in oncology, maybe not, because there's also all these new technologies coming in oncology, like cellular therapies, that are reviving further investments, which is great. But I just get the feeling that there's more attention to this unmet need in neuro because it hasn't had the kind of revolution like, say, immuno-oncology had in oncology. There hasn't been some kind of like core-based discoveries that opened up a whole new world of how to treat neurodegeneration. In my opinion, maybe there's been some foundational recognition of biology, like certain cell types, like microglia, which is kind of like almost an immune type cell that's in the brain, that's resident in the brain, has clearly been much more appreciated as driving disease in a lot of cases. Alzheimer's, other types of dementia, other types of neuroinflammatory processes. And so in that sense, there have been advancements. I don't want to say that scientists haven't advanced the field, but there hasn't been some kind of like breakthrough. And I get the feeling that investors are starting to put in money because they're feeling that's coming. And so I am optimistic about neuro, but I can't pinpoint like something like I can like immuno-oncology to say, this is the revolution that's happening. But the unmet need is growing, right? The planet's getting older. People are getting older, particularly in the developed economies. The average age is older. And, neurodegenerative diseases are much more prevalent in older populations. So the population of unmet need is greater and it's growing.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I remember the controversy with, is it Aduhelm? It was the Biogen.
Adalimumab, yeah.
Yeah,
right.
The approval was pretty prolific in that I think a couple of the FDA, the people on the board resigned in response to the approval, and then they retracted it somehow to only clinical trials.
Yeah, I don't know the history in detail, but to your point, there was a lot of ambiguity about the state of the drug and is it really, is it good and should it have been approved? And those kind of questions certainly spun around the zeitgeist. But it is because of this, well, there's really nothing out there. And if there's something that even has an inkling of, some patients might benefit, then the regulatory authorities are starting to be a little more open, particularly if the side effects aren't, horrible, to start approving things. And I think part of that is, I don't think a regulator would ever say this, but part of that is just to encourage, more investment, more attention, more interest in doing things in this field. Because obviously, if nothing ever gets approved, investors are going to pull back, and the less science will occur, and then it'll be even longer before we ever try to have understanding of these diseases and ability to treat them.
Right, and it's so emotionally devastating. I think watching someone go through something like that, like it's absolutely devastating.
Yeah, because it changes identity. To get back to what we were talking about before, it's like, who is this person that used to be my mother? And it kind of stretches grief out to a lot longer, right? Like, up to 100 years ago, if people looked like they were not doing well health-wise, they probably would have died pretty soon. And only in the past century or so have we been able to extend, people's lives or have people be unhealthy for long periods, which I think if it was me, I'd still be appreciative that I could still live even if I'm unhealthy. But, everyone has to have their own, perspective on that for their own health and life. But these diseases where the personality starts going away, that unhealthy period isn't just about, well, they can't walk as well or they can't, talk as well. It's like when they talk, they're a different person, or their personality is much more aggressive or less energetic or less engaging or whatever. And that can go on for years. And so it's kind of like the process of death is getting stretched out a little bit. And culturally, we don't, particularly in this country, we don't even deal with normal death well in this country. So when it gets stretched out, I think there's a lot of societal and emotional things that we just don't know how to deal with because of that. And it's a shame. Other cultures deal with death a lot better than we do. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's something that I fear and I think about, because it is one of those things that's inevitable. I have this app. It actually reminds me 5 times a day. It says, "Don't forget, you're going to die." And then it gives me a quote. It's called "We Croak." And it is challenging because I can say it in like a playful way, but the concept of death is terrifying, especially if a loved one, it terrifies me.
Yeah.
I appreciate these different cultures do it better.
You gotta please tell me the punchline on that, because yep, you're going to die without something after that. I need to hear what the other shoe is on that.
So the concept is it's based on Tibetan monks, and they meditate on the decaying of their flesh 5 times a day. And it's actually correlated similar to gratitude to increase your well-being. There's a wonderful, wonderful course out of Yale. It's Dr. Laurie Santos, The Science of Well-being. And she talks about essentially a recipe or an algorithm for happiness. And one of the elements is gratitude. It's one of the biggest elements. Just the act of practicing gratitude, like you wisely pointed out earlier, is revolutionary for what it does to your psychology and your presence and your mindset and your perspective. Another element is reflecting on the notion that, we are here for a short amount of time and that this moment will never be replaced or replicated. It's 1:30 p.m. Arizona time, Friday, May 10th. It's gone, right? 1:29 is gone. Right. And so the 5 times a day, it says, don't forget you're going to die. And then it gives me a thought-provoking quote on just the fleeting nature of life. Yeah. And then they have weekly exercises where every Sunday you can do a kind of activity. And it's all about contemplating the notion of, our fleeting nature. And so it's fascinating when you say other cultures handle it better. And I agree with you. I'm from India. And so I know what it's like there. And it's just very much accepted. And here, it's almost like I want to control it. Like I don't want anything to happen to anybody. And I want to make sure they live forever. And I want to control it. So there's an anxiety to it. Whereas I think in India, my family there, it's more of an acceptance. Like this is just the way of the world. It's
the way the universe works. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, is that the Tibetan Book of the Dead that you're referring to? When they meditate on?
I haven't read it though, but I want to ask you about books that you recommend. Is that one? The Tibetan?
Oh, yeah.
I'll write it down.
I think we mentioned this before. It's once I had kids, I stopped reading fiction. And I've been trying to get back into reading fiction. I was a prolific reader up until then. So that is a question that will be a waste of time in this interview for me to talk about the books. I'll tell you about the hyperlinks I've clicked. I can do that. But the books I've read, I'm not there yet. And I don't want to embarrass myself.
No, not at all. There's nothing you could say to embarrass yourself. You're a freaking neuroscientist extraordinaire. So what else? Like, tell me, you told me what you're excited about. Here's a question for you. And I say this in a way, maybe you can help our guests. When you're talking about infectious diseases, specifically parasites coming out of the eyeballs, I wonder what kind of advice can you give people who are not in your field, who have no idea about some of these risks when you're going to when you're traveling? Because I'm a hypochondriac. So I want to know what I should be avoiding so I don't get parasites. Should I be avoiding food, water, everything?
Yeah, well, I think the number one, because so many things are vectored by it, is don't get bitten by mosquitoes in places where there's dengue, malaria, Zika, et cetera. Because that you can control pretty well by what you wear and when you're out and all that. And so that's probably a big protective layer that you could do right away. A lot of parasites are communicated through water. So where you bathe, what you drink, that's probably one to watch carefully, or, disinfect or boil or whatever. I don't know enough. I mean, I'm not really a parasitologist, so, I'm probably getting outside my expertise here. When it comes to other vectors like food, I really don't know how risky food is for what parasites. And, whether washing the outside of the fruit is enough, or you need to actually peel the fruit or what. Mm-hmm. So I'm probably not a really good person to really ask that question for, because there are so many good resources for that out there, actually. When you travel, what to worry about in those zones. But I get that way when I travel too, especially because I've seen so many photos of these insanely gross parasites and what they do. So, if you're not worried about it and you're traveling, go look at some of those photos, and then that will make you go look at the literature I'm talking about that tells you about how to protect yourself, because you should protect yourself.
All right.
Yeah.
Well put.
And And most of them, my guess is, most of them, when you get back to, developed world medicine, there probably is some way to treat them. It's just not a feasible way to treat millions of people, probably. And so my guess is a lot of them that do happen to travelers probably do not end up in death, is my guess, but I don't really know.
Okay.
So sorry, that's probably not the best question for me and
it's
my expertise.
very helpful. I think in general, just the knowing, the risk. I don't think we think about these things as much as we should. I'm a hypochondriac in many ways, so I worry about these things. In India, when I go there, at our home, we have those mosquito tents. And so it's messed up though, because the mosquitoes are so much stronger than they are here. So when I go there, I'll sleep and then have the mosquito net over, and the mosquitoes are just so strong, they'll get inside of the net. So it almost creates this beautiful space for them to just feast on me all night. So I wrap myself tightly as possible, but I can hear them buzzing around my ear.
I hate that sound. Oh my God. I know that drives me nuts. Yeah.
But they just murder me. And my dad, he says that my blood is naturally sweet, and because they didn't even touch him. And I know that there's something where certain people have a genetic predisposition to being more attractive to mosquitoes.
Yeah.
That's me.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
And the rest of my family.
And I've heard folk things like, taking certain vitamin Bs make you less, desirable by the mosquito. But I just don't know the details there and how true it is. But it is true that some people just attract the mosquitoes more. Some people are just more lovable, I guess.
That's me. The other thing that's kind of the counter issue to it is, so because they don't have as much regulation in India as we do here, so there's a spray. It's called HIT, and it's a bug spray, but it's like loaded with carcinogens, and so it's like very to be spraying, or they have like these little bombs light up, and it's like a smoke bomb and kills everything, and you're there inhaling it. So it's very tricky to manage.
Yeah, I kind of looked into that a little bit because DEET is the common. It's pretty effective, but it is pretty carcinogenic and probably toxic in other ways. And Picardin, I think is what it's called, is a little bit less so. And then there's like these natural things like calendula and things like that are probably even safer, though they may not be as effective.
Right. Yeah,
and so, there are options out there if you want to not use, the nuclear bomb, which is DEET, basically. But again, you could just not use any of those and just really cover up. It's difficult in tropical zones to be so covered up. What?
They put me through the material. So if I have a blanket, like a thick blanket, yes. But then you're trying to get air, right? And they'll come in, but it's awful. I mean, just terrible.
Yeah.
I think I should just stay at home and just never leave my house again. That is
no, that won't work for the explorer. It won't work.
I am an explorer. You're right. Well, tell us how we can follow your work, how we can keep our finger on the pulse. I know your research was just published in a couple different academic journals with the malaria vaccine. How do we follow you? Where do we learn more about your work? What's next for you? What are you excited about?
If I was an academic, I would probably be publishing more. But when you work in a company, a lot of what you do isn't really publishable because it's proprietary, right? And I'm not super active on LinkedIn. My only social media is LinkedIn. I'm not even very active on that. I guess people would find me on LinkedIn and ping me there. But remember, I'm an introvert, so it makes sense that I'm not.
Yeah, I only do LinkedIn too. I feel like when I go on Facebook, it's like I'm crawling into the depths of hell. Instagram's even worse. Don't want anything to do with either. But LinkedIn is good. I learn a lot. I think they've done a lot in terms of some of their algorithms and keeping it very educational. So, I'm with you. I think social media is very toxic, and it's fascinating.
Really?
There's so many conversations we could have about identity. We were talking about, what makes someone who they are. And then you have people who are creating alternate personas of themselves that don't even look like themselves on social media. And so there's a gap between the person that you're talking to virtually and then you see them in real life and you're kind of like, whoa, like who are you? Like you don't even look even close to, this other person. It's very odd.
Yeah, I see it as like what do you call it? The democratization of personal marketing, right? Like, 50 years ago, politicians needed to market themselves, but, average people really didn't have to. But with social media, it's like everyone not only kind of can, but it's almost encouraged and kind of need to, depending on what you do in life. You have to go market yourself. And so it's this aspect of being an average citizen that like just didn't exist at all. Like you didn't market if you marketed yourself, it was to your local community and it was in person pretty much. And again, for an introvert, it's a little challenging.
Yes. Well, I look forward to staying in touch and keeping my finger on all the great things that you're doing and talking about all these things, which I love how fluid and just natural our conversations are. I feel like we could talk about anything for hours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Good questions. So if we ever do this again, we should actually talk about the actual malaria drug itself.
Well, tell us about it, because I don't want to miss that. If we ever do this again, tell us about the actual malaria drug.
Yeah, so people used to do malaria vaccines where they would take the sporozoite, which is the form of malaria that mosquitoes inject into you. Because malaria goes through these different forms. It has like these different stages, kind of like a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, that kind of metamorphosis. It goes through like 3 main stages. Some people would say 4 main stages. And the sporozoite is what's injected into you. And then it goes to your liver very quickly. And then it infects liver cells. And then it turns into the next stage, which is called a merozoite. And so people would take sporozoites, kill them, and then inject them into people as the vaccine. So then you would make antibodies against these sporozoites. So then when a mosquito bites you and injects live sporozoites in you, you already have antibodies that bind the sporozoite and prevent it from getting to your liver, right? That's kind of like the strategy for malaria prevention and vaccines for many decades. And then people discovered a certain protein on the surface of those sporozoites called circumsporozoite protein. And they started making vaccines out of that protein alone. So instead of injecting a whole sporozoite into you as a vaccine, just some portion of that protein. And that's what the vaccines that are now approved that I mentioned are made from, that protein. And so we looked at people that got vaccinated with one of those vaccines. And we looked at 45 people that were in a clinical trial for the vaccine that happened like a decade ago. And we looked at all their antibodies, or not all of them. We looked at antibodies from a bunch of those patients. They weren't patients. They were healthy people in trial testing the vaccine. And we, examined all these antibodies for ones that could inhibit malaria in a mouse model. And we made the antibody out of that. And so the antibody is really what's called a passive vaccine, which is just like the COVID antibodies are, where we're not going to give you some protein that your body makes antibodies against. We're going to give you the antibody itself. And there's disadvantages and advantages to that. The idea of a vaccine is that you have immunity for the rest of your life, generally. You might need to get boosters, but that's the benefit of a vaccine. However, usually vaccines take multiple injections to give you that kind of immunity. Whereas if you give someone the antibody, not only do you give them the immunity immediately, right? You give them the injection, they are now immune if it works, right? They don't have to build immunity over time. So that's great for travelers and people like that, right? That need the immunity immediately. Or if you're trying to prevent malaria in children that are in the middle of a rainy season where there's lots of mosquitoes around, you don't want to take 3 months or 5 months to build up their immunity with 3 injections. You want to give them immunity immediately. An antibody injection will do that, but the antibody will wane away after months, and then they won't have any immunity at all. So that's the disadvantage, that it can work immediately, but it won't be long lasting. So there's advantages and disadvantages of that. But one of the interesting things that I just want to describe really quickly about it is that when we looked at the people getting this vaccine, the most dominant antibody responses were to the protein were not protective antibodies. The protective antibodies were often in minor responses, like the person didn't make very many antibodies for the most protective antibody, but the person made a lot of antibodies for the not very protective antibody.
Huh.
And through a lot of correlations, and consistent with what other people have shown about malaria, it's very likely that this protein has decoy properties to it, that the malaria evolved to have very immune responsive components in the protein that your body makes a lot of antibodies to really, really well. But the way the protein is, it makes those antibodies not be very protective. So the malaria literally selected for things that your body will respond really well to, but that are not very protective. And then that kind of swamps out the ability for those antibodies that are protective to really dominate your response. And so the word for that is often immune decoy or immune evasion. Those are kind of the words that, and they've been seen in other systems, but that was something we kind of found in this work, was that we actually picked antibodies from a lot of very minor antibody responses and not the really dominant ones. Although some dominant responses in some people can be effective. It's not across the board, but overall, the dominant responses are not protective, and it's probably because malaria has evolved to have some immune evasion properties. That's kind of just weird biology. Yeah,
it's fascinating. So it almost sounds like a living entity.
A what?
It almost sounds like a living entity. Many times when we talk about the way in which things adapt and evolve, it's like a living entity.
It is a living entity. I mean, like the sporozoite is alive. It does swim to your liver. And if some weird mutation happens that makes your immune system respond really well with a not protective response, that's going to be selected for. That means that malaria will not be killed by your immune system, and it'll proliferate more. And then it'll get taken up by mosquitoes that bite you, and then those mosquitoes will go bite other people. And so if a malaria happens to come across randomly an immune evasion mutation, it will be selected for because it'll help that malaria not be killed by immune systems and therefore proliferate and reproduce more, right? That makes sense. I mean, I'm just describing natural selection, but in the context of malaria is all I'm really describing. But it is in real time. It is living real time. And it takes a real immune system that's alive to respond to cause that selection to occur. Yeah. Anyways, and then the other neat thing, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so ultimately this vaccine will be disseminated across Africa and different areas, which would help God knows how many people.
I'm going to answer your question with a long answer, if that's okay. But so technically it is a vaccine because it's a passive vaccine as opposed to an active vaccine, just like the COVID RNA vaccines were active vaccines, but the antibody drugs were passive vaccines, actually. And passive or active, because active means your immune system actually learns and has that memory for a long time, whereas passive is just like you get it, and if it disappears, you don't have any immunity. But we engineered it to be very developable. So the drug could be concentrated and allow it to go through very tiny needles for babies and children. And the idea is if this succeeds, yes, it will be given, by governments and the Gates Foundation and other nonprofits to millions of people in Africa. But under the best scenarios, that's still, 3 to 6 years away, probably, because it takes that long to go through all the clinical trials. But if this clinical trial that's happening now is successful for safety and efficacy, which is healthy volunteers in like a hospital setting, the next trial will be in children, probably in Africa, probably in the field. But that'll still be a clinical trial. And then if that's successful, there'll be a big phase 3 trial. And if that's successful, yes, it'll go to millions and millions of children.
Incredible.
And the target population is like 6 months old to like 5 years old.
It's incredible.
But something like 600,000 kids, or no, something like 500,000 kids a year die from malaria in Africa alone. So that's like 500,000 children every year dying from this disease, let alone the millions that are affected by the disease but don't die, but still have, unhealthy lives, don't reach their potential, stunted growth, all those kinds of things. So, with the vaccines that are already happening, and then the monoclonal antibody drugs, this one that, I worked on, and then a couple others that are also in the clinic and advancing ahead of it, there could be a huge revolution in treating malaria in the coming decade. And we could effectively cure it and eliminate it in the coming few decades, possibly.
It's incredible.
So, yeah,
and
it's great. It's really awesome.
Yeah, when you talk about purpose-driven life, and you're saying 3 to 6 years, this could potentially, save 500,000 children minimum a year. And then the other thing I was going to say is, when was the last time that there was any, you mentioned this earlier in the episode, but when was the last time that there was anything that happened in the malaria space, like a development? It's been...
Well, there's lots of things. I mean, just getting bed nets, we were talking about bed nets before, to everyone that could use one, like that wasn't happening 30 years ago, right? I mean, there are millions of people that could have had bed nets and not gotten malaria that didn't. And so just something as simple as, a bed net that costs $1 to millions of people makes a huge difference. So, to be fair, I mean, these drugs and vaccines are great, but there's all kinds of other work that people have done, tireless work that social workers, politicians, doctors that were working in the field have done to, prevent malaria, from bed nets to small molecule drugs, artemisinin and other drugs, just getting rid of swampy areas where the mosquitoes are breeding. All of those things have had huge effects and saved lots of lives. And people that have done that deserve a ton of credit. So, I don't want to say that like nothing was happening on malaria until these drugs came along. It's just that if you really want to cure malaria and completely get rid of it, the idea is eliminate it, you will need a vaccination strategy and a drug treatment strategy of some kind. You can't do it alone with bed nets. And the problem with the small... Right. And the small molecule drugs get resistance over time. That's the problem. We keep having to cycle with new drugs because they get resistant. Same thing happens with pesticides, by the way. They get rid of mosquitoes with the pesticides, but then mosquitoes generate resistance to pesticides. And that's, that kind of stuff has been going on literally for over 100 years. Right? We were using pesticides over 100 years ago, and then the malaria or the mosquitoes would get, resistance to it, and then they try to go find a new one. And so,
right.
Fascinating history.
No, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
When I think about the impact of your work over the course of your lifetime, I mean, that's very, very inspiring to be able to make that level of an impact for someone for someone who's in the industry where you humbly say 90% quote unquote failure rate. But when you have that development, I mean, you're talking about saving hundreds and thousands, millions of lives. It's incredible.
It's a privilege. I mean, it really is a privilege to get to work on stuff that matters. It's also super interesting to work on. Like, I'm super lucky. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's so great to learn about you and your psychology and your life and your mindset. Really fascinating. I'm so happy that you were able to come on the show and really share a lot of this. I think our guests would, our audience will really appreciate this. So thank you.
Me too, Sadhna. It's totally fun and interesting. So thanks. It's cool. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. I'm Dr. Sadhna Bokhiria, and this is Leader Voices. This show is brought to you by the American Express Leadership Academy Alumni Network and leaderstories.org. Leader Voices is audio engineered by Robbie Ladd and produced by Creepandian team at OTVO Digital. Special thanks to Caitlin Johnson and Michael Chang. Thank you, and see you in the next episode.